everyone, and welcome to the first chapter of the second book in this Art Journey series. This book will give you the gift of artistic memory, teaching you how to understand things around you, using the basic fundamentals of drawing. Before I start, I would like to inform you that with this book, the lessons will be split into two videos, a lecture video and an exercise video. So once you watch this lecture video, please go to the exercise video and start doing the exercises on this lesson. Watching tutorials on its own won't help you to be a better artist, doing the work well. So please, after you watch this lecture video, go there and have some fun problem solving the exercises. Now, the importance of learning the fundamentals of drawing after you finish learning how to see in the first book is immense. Now that you can see the world as it is, it's time to understand why the world looks the way it looks. What is the science and physics behind what you are observing with your own eyes? Understanding how the world works will not only give you the ability to manipulate it later on for your own designs, but it will help you create new original ideas in new original worlds that no one ever seen before. Knowing how the sunlight works can give you the opportunity to create worlds with two suns with different colors and shadows. When you master the fundamentals, you will be able to communicate your ideas and designs in a clear and correct way. You may think that what you want to create doesn't fit the real world rules or physics, and you won't need the fundamentals for that, because maybe you are creating different worlds with different rules of physics. But as always, in order to break the rules, you need to learn them first. In order to create new rules for imagined world, you need to learn how they work in normal conditions, to modify them later on. I decided to start with the light and values as the first fundamental of art, for a good reason. Without light, we can't see anything. Light is a defining factor of forms, edges, and boundaries. Without it, nothing can be seen or known. Now, we learned in the first book all about lines and shapes, but in this book we're gonna learn that all forms are defined by light, or the absence of. There is actually no lines in the real world, only planes reflecting the light at different angles, and by different local properties. So the first chapter of this book we will be covering everything about light and values, starting with the first lesson, light, an artistic analysis of light and values. Now remember that everything I'm going to talk about here are things that I learned from my own experience and research while observing the master artists of the new generation and the old masters. So everything I talk about here is subject to correction from a higher level artist out there or physicist. So learn whatever you can from my videos, but then do your research and reach your own conclusion based on your own observations. I'm gonna try not to dive deep into the physical aspect of electromagnetic spectrum and what light physically is. I'm gonna try to stay close to what you need to know about light as an artist. To make things simple, light is a form of energy. And when we talk about light, of course, as artists, we mean the visible light. The visible light is a visible range of electromagnetic radiation spectrum that the human eye can see bouncing off things around us. So let's take a trip together to see where light comes from, all the way from the birth of a light wave to us seeing it. Light is emitted from an object or a light source as waves. When an electron gets excited by a specific amount of energy, it goes to a higher orbit around the atom. And when the electron goes back to the lower orbit, it has to get rid of that energy as a light wave. These orbits have different level of energy requirements. Every level is not the same as the one before or after. And every level requires different energy to boost the electron to the next orbit. The energy required to boost an electron up comes as a light wave. If it hits the electron, it goes up a level. And if the electron goes down a level, it releases the same amount of energy on its way down. These emitted light waves have a variety of wavelength frequencies that range between a very long radio wave to the very small gamma rays waves. And the length of the waves, as we said, depends on the energy the wave is emitted by. Cooler objects emit light with longer frequencies, and hotter objects emit light with a shorter frequency. So the higher the energy, the smaller the wavelength. A tiny part of that wavelength spectrum is visible to us. A frequency roughly range between 450 to 750 terahertz can only be seen through the human eyes. Each of these wavelengths is received in our eyes and interpreted in our brain as certain colors. The lower the value, the shorter the wavelength will be. For example, the blues are between 450 to 500 terahertz. These are the short waves, and the reds are between 620 to 750 terahertz as a long wave. Now we can see this effect in our daily life. As we turn on the heater, it goes from deep red to orange to bright yellow. Or for example, when the stove gets hotter. But the stove only gets to bright yellow because you need higher temperature to get even brighter than yellow. But let's say you have a mythical powerful stove that goes all the way to 10,000 kelvins or 9,700 degrees Celsius. The color will shift from yellow to a white color, and as the temperature gets even hotter, it will go all the way to a blue color. Now the reason it goes from yellow to white then blue rather than green then blue is this graph. I found this in the physics.stackexchange.com, and the explanation for the color shift is a black body have a heat curve to follow, and that curve goes from red to blue as it gets hotter. Now at 5500 Kelvin it will reach the center of the graph where all the colors combine into white. So it goes from red to yellow to white and then to blue instead of green. Now of course there are different scientific explanations further on why this graph even exists or it is the way it is, but this is too deep for an art video and more into the quantum physics video. So if you need more on this, you can check out the website and see it for yourself. But what matters for us is when objects get hotter, it emits light in a faster waves, shifting the color from red to blue. Now the same phenomena led to the discovery of the red and blue shift concept. This concept is used by astronomers to calculate the distances of galaxies around us. If the galaxy is moving toward us, the light will be compressed in shorter waves, giving it a bluish color, while the galaxies moving away from us due to the expanding of the universe stretch the wavelength, giving it a reddish color. So now that the light is emitted from the light source on an object, the smallest quantity of that wavelight or energy that can be emitted as a unit is called a photon. A photon is both a wave and a particle with a zero mass. It has both an electric wave and a magnetic wave. That's why light is called an electromagnetic wave. But what is important for us is when these photons band together, we get rays that travel in straight line. Rays group together, making up the light we see. Now when these photons hit an object, make the object visible for us, either by reflecting the light wave of the object or the object absorbing the light wave. Now when the object absorbs the light wave, sometimes it doesn't absorb all the light wave. It only absorbs a certain range of the wave and reflects some of the wavelength. When that happens, that's what gives the object their color. Certain objects reflect certain type of wavelength, depending on the materials that are made of. Think of a material as a wall, with a specific holes. All wavelengths pass through these holes except one or two wavelengths that get reflected out. Now the rest will be absorbed and turned into heat. For example, a red apple absorbs most of the color wavelength and reflect only the red wavelength, which then bounce off the object, hit the retina inside our eyes, and stimulate the red, green, blue cone cells in our retina in different ways, sending the result of this stimulation by a signal via the optic nerve to the brain, which will process it to be a red colored apple. This is how we see things around us. Now the fact that certain elements absorb certain light waves and reflect others helped astronomers figure out the element in distant galaxies and planets by the colors emitted of their light source or their atmosphere. Emits different light waves, which then can be seen as different colors. Another example is green plants. Plants look green due to the chloroplasts, which are tiny factories inside the cells of the plants. Inside these factories there are pigment called chlorophyll. It's a green pigment found in the chloroplast and is an important part of the light-dependent reactions. The chlorophyll soaks up the energy from the sunlight. It captures the red and blue waves of the light and reflects the green wavelength. And then that color is reflected out toward us. And that's why most plants are green. Now when an object reflects all light waves, it becomes a white object. And when an object absorbs all light waves, it becomes a black object. Now when the object absorbs light waves, it turns it into heat energy. That's why people wear white bright colors in summer and darker clothes in winter. Different materials and objects absorb different amount of light quantities and wavelengths depending on the material and the properties of the object, but we're gonna talk about that later on. Now the local colors depends on the light being white to give it true colors. If the light source was colored, it means that the light is emitting one specific light wavelength instead of all the visible spectrum wavelengths. For example, if you shine a red light on a red apple, it will reflect it all out. But if you shine a green light on a red apple in a black room with no other light source, you won't see that red apple, due to the apple absorbing the green light wave entirely and emitting nothing back. This is called additive color mix. Adding all the light wave colors will result in a white light. In painting, on the other hand, it's called subtractive color mixing. Every paint absorbs a certain amount of external light, and the more paint you add, the more light it will absorb until there are no more light to absorb. That's why if you mix green and red as in complementary colors, you will get gray colors. And if you mix all the colors, you will get black color paint. Now when we talk about certain reflection happening when the light hit the object, we are talking about diffuse reflection. Diffuse reflection is the reflection of light on an object that is scattered at many angles, rather than at just one angle, which gives us the color of the object. That happens when the material have rough texture. Materials that are smoother on the surface, like a mirror for example, have a different type of reflection. It's called specular reflection. That happens when the object reflects the light at one angle. I will talk about reflection later on, either in this video or a second video depending on how long this one gonna be, but most certainly in another video. But for now, this is it for colors and how we see them. We're gonna talk about colors in a whole different chapter. As for now, we're gonna talk about light and values, how the light changes the values on an object and to what degree. So now we know what light is and how we see things. What does the knowledge of light properties add to us as artists? As artists, we deal with the light mostly as values. When the values change from one surface to another, we know that this shift is due to the direction of the light and the shape of the form it shined on. The direction of the light and the shape of the form are two factors that affect the change of the value in the scene, along with the material and texture of the object, the type of light, and the position of the observer. Light is used in a scene to sculpt the idea out of random objects by putting the light source in an exact position where it should be, to emphasize the outline of forms and values of the focal point. Light source position should communicate your idea and complement the form. We use the light to tell the viewer where to look. The light source location is a focal point enhancer by itself. Using different light locations and sources tell different stories of the same location. Now values are the amount of information sent to us with the light ray emitting from the scene. 0% values mean no information, complete darkness. 100% information values mean maximum amount of information, or a bright scene. The values for the painting is the structure the painting stands on. Without correct values, colors won't work, perspective won't work, and the story behind the painting won't work either. Values move the viewer's eyes around the painting in a dynamic way. Values should work alone even without applying colors. It should be the foundation of colors. See, the values work without colors, but colors won't work without values. Values are used to create the illusion of depth on a canvas, a third dimension, to 2D drawings. It creates that illusion by adding a gradation of tones representing different values that sculpt the form. Values are used to create a focal point of the subject matter in a painting. The contrast of these values is the degree of focus you are willing to give to that certain object. Now other factors that affect values are the local colors of the object, the light source intensity, the surrounding objects, also the object form, materials, and textures. The form principle is the analysis of nature in terms of geometrical solids, which can be rendered according to laws of tonal contrast. To put it in a simple way, the form principle is light plus terminator plus shadows, which are equal to values, which are the definition of a form. These values sometimes are called the modeling factors. These are the tonal steps from light to shadow. There are no hard-drawn edges between the modeling factors. The borders between these zones show where the form takes a hard turn as an edge, or a soft turn that will lead to a softer borders as in lost edges. Values change rapidly on turning angles more than continuous straight surfaces. Now when light hits the form, it affects the form in different ways, depending on the surface normal. In a three-dimensional form, a surface normal to a surface is a vector that is perpendicular to the tangent plane to that surface. Depending on the light direction, if the surface normal is 100% facing the light direction, it will be the brightest part of the form. It will be absorbing the full energy coming from the light source. If the surface normal has an angle larger than 0, it will start getting less than 100% of the light source photons. The surface at this point will get dimmer, due to the photons not hitting the surface at that angle. When the angle of the surface normal reaches 90 degrees, none of the light rays will hit the surface, and it will have no effect on it. If there is no other light source, this surface will look absolutely dark. Planes facing the light will be the brightest, and planes turning away from the light will be the darkest. As for the edges are the place where the form turns toward or away from the light. It's the border where the values change from one place in the form to the other. Edges' softness or sharpness depends on the values around them. The edges in light area are usually sharper and have more colors and contrast on them, while in shadows, edges are softer with duller colors and less contrast. But as a whole, the edges will be softer in midtones in both the light and dark areas, while the sharpest and the most saturated edges happen in between the two areas, in between the light and shadow. It's where the most amount of contrast happens. Not all shadows are created equally. For example, the shadows on the form itself are soft, while the cast shadow of the form on the ground is hard. Now the hardness and softness of the cast shadow, however, depends on the size, direction, and intensity of the light source itself. Edges are also affected by atmospheric perspective, something we're going to talk about later on. But for short, the edges that are coming toward you are hard-edged, and the one going away from you are soft-edged. Another factor that affects the edge is the type of matter and the nature of the form itself, as in the materials. The materials influence the edge type. For example, hair will be soft-edged, while metal is hard-edged. The softness and sharpness of the edges are called lost and found edges. They can be used as a focal point. You can make your focal point sharp-edged while leaving the background in soft stroke, giving more importance to your object. They did that a lot in the Impressionist art style, but we will talk more about lost and found edges in the upcoming videos. Making the values and contrast of your form and edges more interesting makes your paintings more interesting overall. Now all these rules of edges and forms are made to be broken, so make it as a tool to point to whatever you want the viewer to look at. Even if it may not be physically accurate, just learn first how it works, then break it later. We as artists use the light to guide our viewers, just like they do in video games. They guide the player toward their objective by light. For example, in this scene, we can see that all doors are the same, but only one have a flickering light on it. That means you have to go through that door. And you can use the same concept in your painting to show the viewer where to look. We're gonna dive in details on all these concepts later on, with different exercises. Remember, this is just an introduction for the light and values. Now before getting into how to draw the shadows or calculate the values on an object, let's talk about the different types of lights out there. There are two major types of lighting. It's either outdoor or indoor, and each have many types of lights under them. The outdoor lighting scenarios have many factors dictating the lighting situation. Factors like time of the day, time of the year, as in seasons, weather conditions, atmospheric conditions, and so on. Now the normal lighting situation outdoor is the direct sunlight. It comes with a 3-point lighting system. It's the most detailed light system that gives you the best result. It contains 3 systems of light: the sun as a direct light, the blue sky as the ambient light, and then the bounced light from objects on the ground. This system have sharp shadows due to the direct light. This of course in the case of clear skies. With overcast, the shadows will be softer. Now as we said, the intensity, the colors, and the coverage of this type of light is affected by time, location, and weather condition. So let's talk about the first factor, the time of day. And every period of the day has its own properties and light qualities. Here are some of the daily periods where the light properties will become different than others. The dawn period. It's recognized by the appearance of indirect sunlight being scattered in the atmosphere. When the center of the sun disk reaches 18 degrees below the horizon, or about 30 minutes before sunrise, we will have the dawn period. Now of course the dawn is sectioned into different scientific periods like the astronomical dusk, the nautical dusk, and the civil dusk, occurring at 18, 12, and 6 degrees below the horizon respectively, but let's just call it dawn from 18 degrees below the horizon up to the sunrise. At this point there is no direct sunlight. The sun isn't up yet. It's mainly ambient light reflected from the sky as a primary source. At this time, objects will have purple shadows due to the color of the ambient light. It will also have a pink hue light due to the ambient light from the sky and the bounced light from the landscape. And the shadows in this period will be softer due to the ambient light instead of a direct light. Now the sunrise. This is the moment when the disk of the light appears on the horizon in the morning. The light will come at a side angle, so the shadows will be elongated and softer. The colors will be the same as the dawn period, with purple and pink shadows, but with more of a yellowish direct light. The early morning to the late morning is the time from sunrise to 11 or 12 p.m. The sun will come at an angle, about 45 degrees. The shadows will be long and the light intensity will be stronger. Shadows will be sharper and more toward the blues, and the sun will have a yellowish color. The noon period. At this period the sun will be right at the top, at 90 degrees angle perpendicular to the ground, making the shadows look the sharpest and the smallest, mostly underneath the object. The light will look white and the shadow will be bluish color. The afternoon is from the noon time at 12 p.m. all the way to 1 hour before sunset. The sun will be at an angle again, but from the other way, from the west. The light will be more yellow and the shadows will be elongated and tinted blue. Sunset is when the sun is about to go down below the horizon. Sky will have red and orange colors due to the Rayleigh scattering, something we're going to talk about later on, which gives the sky reddish and orange color at sunset and sunrise. The shadows will be longer, with purple to violet shadow, and much softer than before. The dusk period. The dusk period occurs after sunset. Once the top of the sun has passed the horizon is the dusk time. Now, as we said with the dawn, there are astronomical dusk, nautical dusk, and civil dusk, occurring at 18, 12, and 6 degrees below the horizon respectively. But let's just call it all dusk 0 to 18 degrees below the horizon, or around 15 to 30 minutes after sunset. There is no direct sun at this point, just ambient light as a main source. The ambient will be more toward the blues and violet with a hint of orange for the bounced light. The twilight is basically the civil dusk or the civil dawn. It's when the sun is 6 degrees below the horizon, either at sunrise or sunset. There will be more light in the sky than the total dawn or dusk, and there will be a hint of a green light where the sun have to set or to rise, again to the Rayleigh scattering. It's the same lighting for the dawn or dusk, but with more orange tint and a slightly fading sunlight. The night time is between the dusk of the sunset all the way to the dusk of the sunrise. There is no hint of the sun in the sky. It will be mainly lit by faint skylight, or the moon if it's full. When the moon is up, it will give the scenery a cool light blue tint, with much darker purple shadows. Of course, there are other factors that can light the night scene. The Milky Way, for example, in the complete wilderness, or the artificial lights of the streets, which will change the lighting condition accordingly. Now I have to mention two photography terms here that can be used as well: the golden hour and the blue hour. The golden hour is a period of time shortly after sunrise or before sunset, during which daylight is redder and softer than it was when the sun is higher. Because the contrast is less during the golden hour, shadows are less dark and highlights are less likely to be overexposed. The warm color of the low sun is often considered desirable to enhance the colors of the scene. It's the best time of the day for any type of photography, since the light is properly diffused and warm. The blue hour, on the other hand, is the opposite period, which we mentioned before as the twilight period, just before sunrise or after sunset, when indirect sunlight is evenly diffused. It's the period of twilight in the morning or evening. Indirect sunlight takes on a predominantly blue shade. Many artists value this period for the quality of soft light. Although the blue hour doesn't have an official definition, the blue color spectrum is most prominent when the sun is between 4 to 8 degrees below the horizon. Those are mostly all the times of the day, where light and shadow conditions change from one time to another. Now these times will totally change if the weather is anything but a clear sky. Weather conditions will change the way the light and shadows look like. Here are some of the examples of weather conditions. The light overcast. In case of summer light clouds covering the sky, there will be softer indirect light and much softer shadows. The local colors will be more saturated and more true compared to any other condition. The shadows will be at a minimum. There will be no cast shadows, mostly ambient occlusion shadows. Now, the darker overcast in case of a heavy winter cloud cover, objects start losing the intensity of their color. They will tend to go more toward the grays. There will be no hint of direct light whatsoever. Only ambient, scattered, low-intensity light, with almost non-existent shadows, except for ambient occlusion shadows. The same weather condition can be seen in the rain. When it's raining, you will have the wind moving the trees and the water dust particles in the atmosphere. These dust and water particles will increase the atmospheric perspective in the scene, something we're going to talk about later on. But things are going to be fading away faster as they move away from us. The light will be at minimum. It will be like a darker overcast. Shadows are non-existing, only the occlusion shadow. Also, reflections will increase due to the wet surfaces in the scene. Now as for the snow, when it's snowing, the particles in the atmosphere are much larger than the dust or the water particles. The visibility will be much less and the atmospheric perspective will be much heavier. Distant objects will fade away in white and gray tones, while sharp whites will appear every place the snow covers, and the shadows will be at minimum, only as occlusion shadows, and they won't be very contrasted due to the white surroundings. As for fog or smog or smoke, mist, haze or fog, all of these atmospheric conditions will affect the atmospheric perspective in the scene. We will cover all of them in the atmospheric perspective section. Now these conditions change from day to day and season to season. So do seasons change the light and value conditions? Of course. And here is a quick run of the 4 seasons. The summer and spring colors will be more vibrant. The light will be sharper and the sky will be in clear blues most of the time. The sun will be in a higher position, which makes the shadows a bit shorter and sharper. As for the fall will change the color of the environment, especially in the trees toward the yellows, red and orange colors. That may affect the overall values of the scene. The sky will see more overcast days, which will scatter the light into ambient light and shorter shadows. As for the winter, the sun will be lower in the sky, affecting the shadow, which will be longer and softer. And of course, rain, snow and storms will happen more often, changing the condition to the one we talked about before. There are other outdoor lighting conditions that will depend on other things other than time and weather, such as sunbeams or God's rays. These happen when the sun shines behind objects, blocking the sun, like clouds. It shows due to the light hitting moist and dust in the clouds and the atmosphere. This effect can also be noticed indoors, from a light coming through a window toward a dusty room, or a flashlight in an abandoned building. Another condition is night condition but under street lights, which may add a second local artificial light source other than the moon, like fire or electric lights, bulbs, or other light sources, which will give either yellow or white local spotlights to the scene, and may add double or more shadows to the object. Another condition can be called half-in light. This is mostly used as focal point. When the light is hitting a building or an object just halfway, leaving the rest in shadows, it will be considered a focal point. This can be also used for character, lighting a part of the character that you want people to look at. Finally, we have the underwater lighting, where the sun will penetrate the surface of the translucent water, which will scatter the light in bluish-green hues, projecting caustics on the object underwater, with a bit of a chromatic aberration, something we're going to talk about later on. So every aspect of time, weather and daily condition can change the light situation for the outdoor values. Now, as beautiful as the outdoor lighting condition may be, you may find yourself wanting more controlled lighting conditions. In this case, you will choose to light your object in a studio or indoors. Lighting situation indoors can be as varied as the outdoor, but with more control. These lighting conditions are controlled not by time or weather, but with distance from the light source, the temperature of the light source, the color of the light source, or the intensity and size of the light source. Other factors can be the brightness, the hardness and softness of the shadows, and finally the light decay or the fall-off, which is the rate of light strength diminishing over distance. All these factors affect the values indoors, along with the surrounding objects, which will affect the bounce light and the way values appear. For example, dark objects will appear darker when they are surrounded by light objects, and vice versa. Indoor lighting has more of bounced light and occlusion shadows than the outdoor lighting. Now let's see some examples of the indoor lighting conditions and directions. First, we can have a window with direct sunlight. This will mimic the 3-point lighting system of the outdoor, as there is a yellowish color for the direct light, a blue ambient light from the sky, and finally the bounce light inside the room. But when we don't have the direct sunlight, we are gonna have a window with ambient light only. So the sun doesn't directly shine into the room, but there is the bluish ambient sky bouncing inside, acting like a primary source of light inside the room, along with the bounce light as a secondary source. When we have a window at night with moonlight coming inside the window, it can be considered a direct light source. But when the moonlight isn't directly hitting the window, we will have an ambient purple colors and maybe some street lights if they are outside. The light will be faint and the shadows will be dark. Any light inside the room will be the primary light source for the scene. Next we have artificial lighting, electrical lights like greenish blue fluorescent light or point source like light bulb, which is more toward the orange-yellow light. The softness and the sharpness of the shadow will depend on the location and the size of the light source. We can also have a candlelight or a firelight. It will have an animated red, yellowish or orange light. The light won't be that intense, especially indoors, which is due to the decay factor. The light coming from a candle or a fire source will decay very fast. That means it will shine to a very small space around the light source, but not all the way to the end of the room. Other indoor light sources will be luminescence or self-illuminating objects. It can be natural or artificial, like as in bioluminescence or fluorescence. The color on luminous object will change temperature as it gets more bright. Basically it will turn to white the more intense the light is. The less intense it will get, the more colors it will have. We can also have a hidden light source. For example, if you have an indirect lighting inside the room, you can see the light source itself, but you can only observe its effects. This light source will act as an ambient light instead of a primary light, shifting the bounce light to be the secondary light source. Now all these light sources can be placed in certain ways to emphasize your object and storytelling. So let's see how we can place our light source, both indoor or outdoor. Now we can place the light source in any direction we want, but some of these directions have different properties. For example, the high frontal lighting or the noon light. It's used for character design or movie investigations. It looks like an angelic light. It gives the focus to the head of the character or the top of an object. It's used as a focal point but gives a bad symmetry. The better option will be a 45-degree angle to the left or to the right. This light direction is more dramatic. It's interesting. Sometimes it's called the Rembrandt light, famously used by Rembrandt in his paintings. It adds a bit of a light triangle on the other side of the face. It's very contrasted and gives a very good details. Another one can be a middle front side. This is mostly seen in flash photography or foam photography. It gives a flat symmetry with less form defining shadows. There is also the rim light, or sometimes it's called edge lighting or backlighting. The object here is blocking the light source, so it's lighted from behind. It touches the side of the form. It will give bright edges with less detailed form. Then we can put the light source from the bottom, below the object. The light here will appear mysterious, sinister, very dramatic, or spooky. It's used mostly for villains or scary situations. Finally, we have the reflected light or the fall light. It's done by using a reflectors or a large indirect light source. This is mainly used for advertising to get the soft shadows. Now the best indoor lighting system is the one that mimics the real world, the 3-point lighting system. It's the natural way for things to look detailed in nature. The system consists of a direct light source, a fill light ambient, and bounce light. We can mimic this indoors for characters or objects by using a key light 45 degrees from the top, a rim light from behind the object, and a fill light for the ambient light. Now this kind of light type and directions has been used differently in different art styles throughout the ages. The difference between these art styles has been mostly by the way the diffused light is controlled, or the ambient light. Either too strong shadows to add contrast, or overexposed as a style, or balanced to get the best of two worlds. Some of these styles are the classical light, the Renaissance or the Rembrandt light that we talked about. This one is controlled. It has dark shadows and a bright light coming from the top left. The term chiaroscuro is an Italian term used by artists for the high contrast between the light and the dark to achieve a 3D sense of the form. that has been used for figure drawing and objects in paintings in the Renaissance era all the way to the 19th century. Another lighting type is the Impressionist lighting. They used values and colors as shapes to represent the shadows, without using any blacks. They manipulate the lost and found edges to represent the focal point of the object, without any hard shadows. Finally, we have the modern HDR lighting. The light and shade in this style are fully exposed. The only thing you see is local color and values, with no dark shadows at all. It's a modern style built on the Impressionist style but using digital technology. Now there is no right or wrong style here. Choose the light that fits your style. So let's talk a little bit about the shadows and some of their properties. There are two types of shadows, sharp shadows and soft shadows. Objects will cast a sharp shadow on the ground if the light source is small or the light source is a direct light source like the sun. Objects will have sharp shadows on the form itself if the surface has hard edges or the turning angle of the edge is hard. On the other hand, the object will have soft shadows on the ground or the light source is weak and far away. Objects will have soft shadow on the form itself if the surface is curved and the turning angle is soft. Now objects will have smaller cast shadow to non-existence with only some occlusion shadow if the light source is oversized and close to the object, or if it's an overcast day. Now as for the shadow hues, we're gonna talk about the colors later on, but for now I need to mention the common rule that we all heard about. The rule says if you have a warm light, you will have a cold shadow, and if you have a cold light, you will have warm shadows. This is taught usually as a contrast trick to make your focal point pop, but there is actually a reason for it. The warm-cold theory won't work in a dark room with only one light source. It's actually due to the sky color and the environment ambient light. This is what affecting the colors of the shadow. When the object is in the open environment and the object is casting a shadow, only the direct warm light is blocked by the object, but the cool ambient environment light isn't, and it gives that blue tint to the shadows, causing the shadows to be cool. So you will have a warm light and cool shadow effect. The same thing can be said about the other way. If the light is cool, the environment will be warm and the shadows will be warm as well. Now for the indoor lighting, depending on the light direction and the local colors of the object reflecting the light, the up-facing planes affected by the bounce light will be cool due to the ambient light color from the environment, but the down-facing planes will be warm due to the direct light bouncing off the ground to the object. So that's why the plane on the object when they are facing down will be warm and when they are facing up will be cool. And of course that will depend if the light is cool or warm. To see how the light affects the surface, we're gonna study the basic form. The most detailed basic form is the sphere. So let's see how the light affects a sphere and all the different forms it creates. But before we do that, we need to know about the value scale. The value scale is a system of organizing values. It consists of 9 values, ranging from white to black, in addition to the pure black and pure white, making it 11 different values. There are other value scales out there. Sometimes it's 9 values, sometimes it's 7 values, but the most detail is 11 values. These shades of gray make up the meat of the drawing. They help to create the illusion of depth and the third dimension. We're gonna use this value for the rest of this chapter, so we have to learn how to create one first. So first we draw the 11 different rectangles side by side and number them from 0 to 10. Leave the first rectangle empty, that will be number 0, which will be the white value. If you are working on this digitally, paint a dark black value on the last rectangle number 10. This will be the black value. If you are doing it in pencil, draw it with an 8B pencil. If you are painting it in oil, use a black paint. Now we have the both ends of the scale. It's time to add the middle value number 5. Number 5 should be the exact middle between the white and black, which means 50% black and 50% white. Estimate that value and paint it in the middle. Now we have two mini small scale that we can start painting. The first value at number 1 is 90% white and 10% black. Make sure that it isn't far away from the previous value, but at the same time it isn't very similar to it. It should look different. Add value number 2, which is 80% white and 20% black. Number 3 will be 70% white, 30% black. Number 4, 60% white, 40% black. And now we have the first part of the scale done. It should look gradual, from white to halftone. If you see a value that is drastically darker or lighter, it will look out of place, and can be easily fixed by adding black or white to it. Now number 6, that will be 40% white, 60% black. Number 7, 30% white, 70% black. Number 8, 20% white, 80% black. Finally number 9, 10% white and 90% black. And now you have a value scale. Save it, name it, and keep it around. We will use it a lot. So now we have the value scale. Let's paint some values. When the light hits an object, like a sphere, it creates areas of light and shadows. They are called the modeling factors. The diagram of these factors are as follows. Center light or diffused light is the direct area where the light hits the object. It's where the surface normal of the object will be facing the direct light the most. Next we have the specular highlight, is where the light reflects off the center light area directly toward the viewer. When the viewer moves, the highlight spot moves as well. It's not the center point of the center light area. It depends on the location of the viewer. It also depends on the material, the glossiness or the roughness of the material. The smoother the material is, the smaller the highlight, and the rougher the material is, the wider the highlight will be. It will eventually become bigger and bigger until it's one with the form light. The center light and the specular highlight only match when the light source and the viewer are in the same place. As you can see here, as the viewer moves around the object, the highlight moves with it, while the hot spot of the center light stays in the same location. The form light is the area where the surface normal of the object starts moving away from the light direction, almost from 5 to 30 degrees away from the light. The halftones are the area between the form light and all the way to the terminator. It's the place where the light starts dimming faster than other areas on the sphere. In between the light and the shadow modeling factors lies the terminator. The terminator is the area where the form transitions from light into the shadow. It occurs where the light rays from the source light are tangent to the edge of the form. It's basically where the light misses the object entirely. The more intense and closer to the light the object is, the harder the edge of the terminator will be. And as the light gets less bright or far away, the more gradual the transition from the light to the shadow will be at the terminator. The terminator is the border of the core shadow. The core shadow is the part of the form shadow that isn't affected by the reflected light. It is the pure shadow of the object without the effect of any bounced light. The form shadow, on the other hand, is the core shadow affected by the reflected light. Thus, it will be less darker than the core shadow. The reflected light is the area where the bounced light from the ground hits the object, lighting the shadow a little bit more than the form shadow. But it will not be as light as the light side of the object, since the bounced light loses energy as it hits the ground and then into the object. The color and intensity of the reflected light depends on the local color of the object and the ground, or any surrounding object around. Then we have the ambient occlusion shadow. It happens when two surfaces are too close to each other that there is no light can bounce in between them. All direct light, ambient light, and reflected light are blocked in this area. The more ambient light there is, the less ambient occlusion will be, and the closer the objects are to each other, the more ambient occlusion will be. At the point of contact between two objects, light is occluded or interrupted, resulting in a dark accent. The cast shadow is the object projection on the floor, or to be more precise, it's the terminator of the object projection on the ground. It also describes the shape of the object projected on the ground or the form or other objects the cast shadow will hit. The cast shadow can be used as a focal point to make contrast between light and dark on other objects that they cast the shadow on. For example, like a person sitting near a window shutter. The shadow of the window will hit the face in a certain way, it will become a focal point. Now the cast shadow itself can be divided into three parts. The closest part to the object extending from the ambient occlusion to a little bit away from the object, where it's the most darkest, is called the umbra. The middle part of the shadow all the way to the edge, called the penumbra. And finally the blurry edge of the cast shadow is called antumbra. Now before we carry on, I have to mention some major mistakes while painting these modeling factors. For example, making the reflected light too bright, as bright as the light side of the form. Remember, every time the light bounces from a surface to another, it dims down a little bit, due to losing some of the initial energy. So the bounce light will not be as intense as the direct light. Another mistake is making the halftones too dark, sometimes as dark as the shadow. So the transition between the light and the dark will come too fast. On the other hand, making the halftone not dark enough, it will make it too bright all the way to the terminator without a decent transition. Just a final reminder, the perspective viewpoint of the form will change the places of the modeling factor on an object, following the perspective lines. When the sphere is high over the horizon, you are basically looking at the bottom part of the sphere, where it will be mostly in shadows. When it's way low beneath the horizon line, you will be looking at the top of the sphere, where it's mostly in light. There are many ways to render the object in a realistic lighting situation. Some artists do it based on the way things look. Some do it out of preferred methods. Others have a certain technique that can be followed and replicated. Now I found that the Scott Robinson method of 1, 2, 3 read is the easiest one to follow. This method is based on the best way to make object read well under any lighting situation. Adding 3 different values to an object, it will make it read well without the need to draw any edges in between. The 3 values are the light, the midtones, and the shadows. The value shift by itself will make the object render as a 3D form. The values will be divided based on the angle of the surface normal. If the surface is under the direct light, it will be given a light value. If the surface is in direct light but at an angle, it will be given a midtone value. And if the light misses the surface altogether, it will have a dark value. The same concept can be applied to any kind of shapes and forms out there. When objects are in 1 or 2 values only, they will look a bit flat. They will not look as detailed as they would in 3 different values. These 3 values, along with the cast shadow value and the reflected light value, will give your form a detailed description, making it well defined in any lighting situation. We can choose these different values from the value scale as follows. Let's look at this cube for example. We will need help from the value scale, so let's put it near the object to pick values from. Now the first value will depend on the local color of the object. If we give the first value a high value between 0 and 5, that means the object is white, or closer to the white. And if we give it a low value, it will be a dark object. So value number 1 will be between 0 and 5. Of course we can go further than 5, but it will be much darker as we go further. The dark surface of the object that isn't hit by a direct light will be the value number 3. The value 3 is called halfway to black, which means it's between the value we picked as value 1 and black. So for example, if the value 1 is 0, the value 3 will be 5. And if the value 1 is 2, the value 3 will be 6. Halfway to black. Value 2, which is in direct light but moving away from the light at an angle, it will have a value in between value 1 and value 3. So if the value 1 is 0, value 3 is 5, and value 2 will be 2.5. This way you have 3 different values on an object, giving it a clear and decent 3D read. Remember that the values will vary depending on the local color of the object. For example, if the local color of the object is 5, which is value 1, value 3 will be halfway to black, which is 8, and the midtones will be at 6.5. This is a dark object, but you can still read it as a 3D object due to the variation of the values. Also keep in mind that the darker the object is, the smaller the value scale will be on the object. Because the halfway to black concept will be less from 8 to 10 than from 0 to 10. So as you can see here, if the value 1 is 8, halfway to black is 9, and the midtones will be 8.5. Not a very large value scale compared to the white object, but still readable nonetheless. Now as for the cast shadow, we will treat it the same as the object. It will also be halfway to black, but from the value of the ground. If the ground value is 0, the cast shadow will be at the value of 5. And if the ground is a value of 5, the cast shadow will be at 8. And if the ground is at 8, the cast shadow will be at 9. The cast shadow also depends on the ambient light intensity. The higher the ambient light is, the lighter the cast shadow will be. The lower it is, the darker the cast shadow will be. As you can see here, even for the same cast shadow, if the local values of the ground is different, the cast shadow will look darker depending on the ground or the objects it falls upon. Another point before we move on. Values also depend on the type of light source. If the light source is the sun, for example, the values will be distributed equally on the forms. But if the light source decays over distances like a light bulb, the values will decay as well from the brightest parts, which are the closest to the object, to the darkest parts, which are the furthest away from the light source. Now as for the reflected light, it will also depend on the values of the ground as well, just like the cast shadow. If the ground is lighter than a value of 5, it will add a bit of reflected light gradation into the adjacent surface. if the ground is darker than a value of 5, it will not add any reflected light. But if the ground is almost black, it may even add a darker values to adjacent surfaces, depending on the reflective factor of the object. So not all reflected light is created equally. Now if the ground has also a color, it will add a different color to adjacent faces, along with the values. Now that we have learned the 1, 2, 3 read concept, let's apply it on a different type of shapes and forms. Now the inclination angle of the form determines the soft or the hard edge of the light. Curved surfaces will have softer fallout than the hard edges. So let's draw some examples. Okay, so what if there is more than 3 faces facing the light source? How do we distribute the 3 values between them? Let's take this shape for example. 4 surfaces facing the light and 1 in the shadows. We still use the same concept for it, just like a box. First we determine the surface normal for the form and the relation with the light source direction. As you can see, one of these surface normal faces the light source at 0 degree, while the others turn away from the light at different angles. The surface that is closest to 0 will be the value number 1, or A. All of the other values that have a larger angle than A, but not entirely in the shadows as a dark surface, will be the value of 2, or B. Finally, the third value will be the one in the shadows. Since value A is at 0 degree angle and the object is white, it will have the value of 0. The one in the shadow will be halfway to black as in value of 5, and the surface that is in between the two values A and C at the degree of 45 will have the value of 2.5. Now here is where you have to do some estimations. The surface that is on top above the A value is at 15 degrees angle, while the surface beneath the A value is at 25 degrees. So the surface on the top should be closer to A than B. So we will give it a value of 1, while the other surface will be at 1.5. The surface in between that have the value of B should be different from each other, but not as light as A or dark as C. That's why giving 3 values work, because you will have much less margin for error of going too dark or too light in the wrong place. Now we can do the same with the shadow, giving value D to the ground and E to the cast shadow. The ground is at mid-tone level of 5 and halfway to black is 8, and that will be the value of the cast shadow. Now let's take a quick look with this example. An artificial light and even more than 5 faces. No matter how complicated the shape gets, the same concept remains. It all depends on the direction of light relation with the surface normal. 0 degrees or the closest to it will be value A, 90 degrees or further away from it will be value of C, and everything in between will be a variation of value B. But what if the surface isn't hard-edged? What if it's a curve? It's the same concept. The surface normal of the form will be more defined into smaller parts. Each part will face the light direction differently. But once you find out the closest angle to the surface normal to the light source direction and then the surface in the shadow, you will have 2 of the 3 values already determined. So in this case, the closest angle is near the top of the object, which will be a value of A. And the surface in the shadow will be the value of C. Between the 2 values will have different variation of value of B, depending on the angle of the light hitting the surface. We also have the value of the ground and the value of the cast shadow as D and E. Again, the value of 45 degrees angle will be halfway between 0 angle as in value A and 90 degrees angle as in value C. Everything between them will be estimated depending on the surface normal. Even if the curve is short or long, the same concept stays the same. You will just have more estimating to do between the values. Okay, let's try some basic shapes now, like a cylinder. Now a cylinder has 2 parts, the top straight part and the curved surface. Every part of the curved surface will have a different surface normal that is either turning toward the light or away from it, but both in this example are not 100% in the direction of the light. So the angle of the surface will not be 0 degree at any part of the curved surface. This is called passive highlight. The passive highlight is where the light hit the curved part of the cylinder directly. The light will be the strongest at the top and it will decay as it goes down, depending of course on the light source. If it's the sunlight, it will be the same from top to bottom. The terminator of the cylinder will be where the light starts missing the object, or be tangent to the object edge. This is where the surface normal starts to be at an angle larger than 90 degrees. The terminator here won't be just a line or an edge, it will be more of a degradation from light to dark, just like a sphere. So this is how the values will be. Value A at the top part, value C after the terminator, and value B from the passive highlight all the way to the terminator. Value D of course for the ground, and E for the cast shadow. As you can see here, I didn't give value A a value of 0, since the surface normal isn't aligned directly with the light direction. It's a slight angle, so it will be less than 100% of the light energy, so it will be approximately a value of 1. The passive highlight of the curved part starts at 45 degrees angle, so it will have a value of 2.5, and the value of C will be at 5, since it's a white object and it's in total shadows. So between the passive highlight and the terminator, we'll have the values start going from 2.5 to 3 to 3.5 to 4 all the way to 4.5, and then finally at the terminator it will be at 5. Once you lock the first and third values, you will be able to determine the light values everywhere else. Now let's do something more complicated, like a sphere. With a sphere, we have to find out the terminator first. The terminator is where the light misses the object entirely, or be at tangent with the surface. Once we determine the terminator place according to the direction of the light, now we can apply the values. Now every part of the sphere will have a different surface normal, pointing at a different direction. So we have to find the surface normal with the smallest surface angle compared to the light direction. And no, it is not the highlight. Remember what we said before, the highlight depends on where the viewer is, not where the actual hotspot is. In this case, the hotspot is a bit more to the right of the highlight. This is value A. The surface after the terminator is value C, and the in between the two will be value B. Ground of course will be the value of D, and the cast shadow will be a value of V. So since value A is at 0 degree angle with the light, it will be at 0 value, and value C will be at 5, and now between them we're gonna see that B is not one value. Value B will be two parts. The first part is in the hot spot of the sphere, will have a value between 0 to 2.5, and when the surface starts to be more than 45 degrees with the light direction, the value will start to be between 2.5 all the way to 5 at the terminator. So we will have a degradation between value of A to value of C, depending on the light source direction relation with the surface normal. Just a final note here, reflected light will have an effect on all these objects. For example, this cylinder will look a bit more lit from the bottom if the ground is lighter than a value of 5. So keep that in mind when you are applying your values. Now these are some of the basic forms that we can apply values to. Now we will have much more complicated examples in the exercise video that is coming along with the lecture video. So if you want to do more exercise on the 1, 2, 3 values, please check out the exercise video. There will be much more to learn there. Okay, now that we know how to assign values to an object, let's see how we can figure out the cast shadow area depending on the light source direction. Keep in mind that this section needs a bit of knowledge in perspective. I should have covered that in some of the basic perspective in the first book. So if you don't know the basic of perspective, please check them out. As for now, let's start with the most basic form, the line. Every basic shape consists of groups of edges or lines. So if you know how to draw the cast shadow of a line, every other object will be basically the same. With an artificial light source, there will be conversion of light rays toward a point, especially if the light is in close proximity to the object. To figure out where the cast shadow is, you need to know two things: the position of the light and the position of the shadow origin. The shadow origin is the projection of the light source on the ground. Once you have both these points, you can draw a line from the shadow origin to the base of the line on the ground, and you will have the shadow direction. To know how far the shadow goes from the object away from it, draw a line from the light source to the top end of the line. The light line will intersect with the shadow line underneath it, and you will have the length of the cast shadow of the line on the ground. This is basically how you can get a cast shadow of a line with an artificial light source. Let's see what happens when the line casts a shadow on an uneven ground, as in different levels, using artificial light. In case of the artificial light, we will have different shadow origin for each level of the ground. Let's start with the first line on the actual ground. We project the light source on the ground to get the shadow origin, and from there we connect the shadow origin to the base of the first line to get the shadow direction. And to know how far the shadow goes, we connect the light source to the top of the object and the intersection with the shadow direction will give us the actual shadow. For the second line on the raised ground, on the other hand, we have to find out the raised shadow origin. To get that point, connect the first origin to the second line. As you hit the raised platform, draw a vertical line. Since this is of course a 2-point perspective, we will have a vertical line instead of a slanted line, in case of a 3-point perspective. Then connect that point to the base of the second line. Now you have 2 points, the base of the line and the contact point on the start of the platform. Connect the 2 points all the way to the shadow projection line and you will have the second shadow origin point. From that point, connect to the base of the second line to get the shadow direction, and then connect the light source to the top of the line and the intersection will be the second shadow. Do the same for line 3 and line 4 and you will have 4 different shadow origin with 4 different cast shadow. Now calculating the cast shadow using the sun as a light source will be basically the same principle, but the shadow origin point will be at the vanishing point on the horizon line, right under the sun position, no matter how low or high the ground is. To explain why, we have to see the sun position as an arc on the sky. Of course the sun is very far away from Earth, but the projection of the sun on the sky will move on an arc as time passes by. All lines of the shadow will converge to the point due to the perspective line, not to the position of the sun. The sun, as we said, is far away. The sun is so far away, the light rays coming from the sun is parallel lines. What we see is just the sun projection on the sky dome. If the sun is in the positive position, that means in the front of the viewer, the shadow will be on the same arc of the sun behind the viewer. And if the sun is in a passive position behind the viewer, the shadow origin will be at the end of the same sun arc in the front of the viewer. If you look at these two cameras side by side from the opposite location, you can see all the shadow goes to the same origin point. They are basically converging to the vanishing point on the horizon. So if you want to find out what point to draw the shadow direction to, use the point underneath the sun, if it is in the positive position, or the place where the sun sets or rises if it is in the passive position. To explain it further, let's look at the wider angle of the sky dome. You can see here the sky dome and the sun arc. As the sun moves, the shadows follow the same arc. When the sun in the positive position, the shadows are on the opposite side on the same vanishing point the sun set at. Where the sun starts, the shadow ends, and vice versa. So to go back to the raised platform and the lines, to calculate the cast shadow we do basically what we did for the previous one with artificial light, but we only use one shadow origin instead of special one per raised platform, since all shadows converge to one point as I explained previously. Just keep in mind that light rays from the sun are parallel, no matter how far or close they are. Since the sun is so far away, they all come from the same direction without any conversion. The only conversion we see is for the perspective line on the vanishing point. By the way, when the shadow reaches a lower platform, you just go down to that level vertically, and then connect from that platform to the same vanishing point to get the shadow direction. We will do more of that in the exercise video. Okay, now that we know how to get the cast shadow for both artificial light and sunlight, let's try to calculate the cast shadow for other basic shapes, starting with an ellipse in the direct sunlight. The ellipse will be a bit different from the normal lines, since there is no top or bottom to project the shadow from. So we need to add points where we can calculate the shadow from. To do that, we have to find the major and minor axis of the ellipse. The major axis will be the widest part of the ellipse and the minor axis will be the smaller part of the ellipse. The minor axis is perpendicular on the major axis with a 90 degrees angle. Next we draw the projection line from the major axis to the ground. We don't need to draw the minor axis projection line on the ground, since here it will hit the same point at the minor axis. As we mentioned before, the shadow projection lines will come parallel toward the object and converge at the horizon line. Since the sun is coming from the left and we can see the horizon line, they will extend in parallel lines from the left all the way to the right. The same thing will happen with the sunlight projection lines, coming in parallel lines from the same direction. So the shadow projection line will hit the projection lines of the major and minor axis of the ellipse on the ground, and we will have the shadow direction. And then we will connect the light source to the top of these lines we made with the minor and major axis projection lines, and by that we will have the intersection line from the light projection and the shadow projection on the ground. Now we can simply draw the shadow as a curve between these three intersection lines. But if you want to make it more accurate, we can draw two more axes in the ellipse at 45 degrees to get two more intersection lines. And we do the same as we did before and draw their projection line on the ground and then connect the shadow line and the light line to these points. Now we have enough points to draw an accurate representation of the shadow on the ground. Again, I'm doing all this in details to make you understand the process. The more you do this, the more you would be able to estimate where the shadow is by instinct, without going through all these steps and guidelines. But if this is your first time doing it, you will have to know why and where and what and every step of the way so you can understand the process. Okay, here is another example, an open curve. Now instead of having a major and minor axis, we will have random points on the curve that we can project to the floor. So I take the beginning and the end of the curve and two in between points as well. Connect the shadow projection line to the base of them and intersect them with the light projection lines. Now you can draw the cast shadow as it is, but if it's still too difficult to draw the curve of the shadow, you can add more in between points for the curve and project them as well. Now we can see the points where the cast shadow is, and we can simply connect the dots to get the correct cast shadow. Now let's try to get more complicated. Let's do actual shapes, starting with a box. To understand the calculation of the shadow for the box, we have to deconstruct the box into basic lines. This box is made of 4 different lines connected together. So if we get the cast shadow for these lines as we did before, the union of the shadow will be the cast shadow for the box. So we can see that this is an artificial light source. So let's drop a projection line to the ground and get the shadow origin. Next, we connect the shadow origin to the base of each line. Next, we can connect the light source to the top of these lines, intersecting with the shadow projection lines. The top edge of the box will be the connection between the end of the shadow lines, and the bottom edge shadow will be the connection between the start of the shadow lines. The connection between the bottom and top surfaces will give us the middle part of the box. Add all that together and you will get the cast shadow of the box. Of course, when we put the box back on top of it, we will hide the bottom edge of the shadow, and you will only see the middle and the top edge shadow together. Now you don't have to do this every time, of course, but this is just for you to understand how it's calculated. To get the shadow faster, just draw where the light source projection intersects with the shadow projection and connect it to the base of the box. Now let's try to do the same thing but with a direct sunlight. Same process, but with parallel lines of shadow and light. The intersection of the top edge shadow will give us the top plane shadow, and the same for the bottom. The union of the two will give us the middle part. All of them together will give us the shadow of the box. Now if we put the two lights together, we can see the difference between the point light and the sunlight. The close proximity of the light source will exaggerate the shape of the cast shadow of the box beyond the size of the original box, while the sunlight cast shadow will be limited to the edge of the box. Next on the list, a cylinder. Same process. First, we get the shadow origin projection on the ground from the artificial light. Next, we need at least 3 points on the cylinder, so we can cast the shadow off. So we can treat the top and the bottom circles of the cylinder as ellipses, like we did before, and find out the major and minor axes of the top and the bottom of the ellipse. The center of the two circles will determine the top edge of the cast shadow. We connect the projection shadow lines from the original point to the center and to the edges of the cylinder. Now to cast the shadow off the cylinder, we can use the 4 points where the shadow projection hit the cylinder as vertical lines from all the sides. We connect the light projection lines to the top of these vertical lines, and the intersection points with the floor will be the cast shadow points. You can draw the cast shadow as it is now, but as before, if it's too difficult, you can add more lines and connect them with the light and shadow projection lines. The top part of the lines will create the top plane shadow, and the bottom one will create the bottom plane shadow. The connection between the two will be the body of the cylinder. All together will create the cast shadow. Let's try the same cylinder in the sunlight. Here the shadow lines and the light lines will be parallel to each other, instead of coming from one point. The rest is the same process as before. If you compare the two together, you will see the difference between the sunlight and the artificial light shadow as before. Let's try something tricky this time. A horizontal cylinder that isn't aligned with the perspective lines. Don't worry, it's the same process. Let's find the major and minor axes of the flat ellipses as before, and connect the axes of both cylinders together. Next, let's find the terminator. The terminator here isn't the connection between the two axes. It is a bit back behind the center, due to the way the light hit the cylinder. If the light is vertical on the top of the cylinder, the terminator will be at the major axis. If the light on the side of the cylinder, the terminator will be at the minor axis. And if the light is in between the two directions, for example at 45 degrees, the terminator will be between the major and minor axis, at the same angle. Now let's draw projection lines from all the axes and the terminator to the floor. Let's connect the shadow lines to all these points, and to make things easier, let's add another point in the middle of the cylinder, and then we connect the light projection line to the top of these lines. Now there is an exception here, since the cylinder is a bit off axis and the way it is positioned on the floor. The cylinder at the terminator from the bottom is a bit above the floor, so we connect the light source to it as well, since the shadow will be casting in that place. And then I added another point to make the shadow more defined, and now we can connect all the points to get the cylinder shadow. Moving to another shape, a cone. The ellipse in this shape is on the bottom, so let's find the axis and the center like we did with the cylinder. Then we connect the shadow projection line to these points, and then we draw the terminator. The terminator here is a bit back behind the center. So let me cut back here and explain why the terminator is behind the center line. If we look here, we can see a box and a cone. And this yellow line is the sun ray hitting both objects. As the light moves toward the cone, it hits the cone at an angle, bleeding more light beyond the center of the cone. The light will be tangent to the cone, a bit behind the center, and there will lie the terminator. In contrast, the light hit the box edge and stopped completely. It won't be bleeding behind the corner due to the hard edge. Now to go back to the cone shadow, we add the light projection next, hitting the terminator top and bottom ends, which is basically all what the shadow is, a simple triangle. Finally, let's see how things go for a sphere. As before, we need to pick some points on the object to cast the light off to the ground. We can do that by drawing the vertical and horizontal circles of latitude around the sphere. We can project the points of the intersections on the ground, and then we find the terminator. And in this sphere, the terminator is a slanted ellipse facing the direct light on a 90 degrees angle. Let's add the shadow projection line hitting the projected points on the ground. And then we add the light projection next, hitting the equator lines and the terminator. We can add two more ellipses to find the cast shadow a bit more. We connect the light lines to the intersection of these new ellipses and the terminator. Now we have our cast shadow points on the ground. Connecting the dots will give us the cast shadow of the sphere. We will stop here with the examples and continue with the exercise video that is coming along with the lecture video, where we will have a bit more complicated scenarios and objects to study. This is how we calculate the cast shadow for the basic shapes and curves. Later on, we will see what happens when the shadow overlaps other objects instead of the ground. We will also see how other organic and mechanical shapes cast shadows, and how the facial feature on a character will cast shadow on each other. These and much more will come on later videos. Now a quick hint to find the direction of the light source in the scene if you only have the values on the form, which is the opposite of what we were doing. To find out, you can easily do the following. Find the terminator ellipse and draw it all around the form while noticing the angle of the terminator ellipse. Find the major axis of the ellipse. Use the cast shadow of the form to determine the minor axis, and then the minor axis of the ellipse will be pointing to the light direction. The size of the terminator ellipse opening will determine the cast shadow direction. It will also direct the size of the form shadow, the center light, and the reflected light. Now with that done, I had much more to add to this first lesson, almost 4 times as more information as we have here. But I realized it's gonna take around 8 hours in total for the first lesson, which is unreasonable. So I'm gonna stop the video here and continue with another part in another video. Remember, this is a lecture video. After you study it, go to the exercise video and do all the exercises to get the benefit of this video. Watching videos alone will not help you if you do not do the exercises. Now I am sorry this video took so long, but all the 3D animation, 2D demonstrations took ages to finish. Hopefully things will be less complicated as we move on. This is just the introduction to the first fundamental of drawing, light and values. In the next lesson, we're gonna dive deeper into more complicated shapes for shadow casting and value painting, along with more information about the forms, the shapes, and the way they react to the light. I really hope I managed to simplify things to you in a way that is easy to understand, and hopefully provided some useful information for the artists out there. As always, if you have more questions, please let me know in the comment section, and I will either answer them in the comments or do videos about them if they are too big to explain in the comments. Before I go, I'd like to thank my Patreons who donated to my channel. If you'd like to donate to my Patreon, please go to patreon.com/rainwalker. Thank you all for your generosity. Alright, this is it for the first lesson. I hope you enjoyed it. Please go to the exercise video now and have fun drawing. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.